kind introduction. I knew that Malte was one of my students at the College of Europe, so my first question when we bumped into each other this morning was, I hope I gave you a good grade. And apparently I did. So the rest is history, and I got invited here, so it's very, very kind of you. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that I'm in a room with people who probably understand the intricacies of data much better than I do. Many of you are techies, probably engineers. You're people who look at issues linked to data pretty much from morning to night. Many of you have a view on how data should be handled and are quite adamant and passionate about it. As am I. But I think my value added this morning is basically to try to set the scene, perhaps from a former legislator's perspective on how we should deal with what has become or what has come to be called the digital revolution or the fourth industrial revolution, the wonderful mix of artificial intelligence and robotization and Internet of Things and digitalization and 3D printing. But at the end of the day, really, the onslaught and the mix between, I would argue, technology and biology. You know, what the hell is that going to do to us at the end of the day? I will give you a little introduction. Then, as custom has it, the Finns will laugh. I have 3 points. And then I will give you a conclusion. My 3 points today is that the digital revolution will change, number one, the economy and the way in which we work. Number two, politics and media, the way in which we communicate and decide. And number three, science and actually the future of mankind. And I will try to conclude by giving perhaps 3 policy suggestions for the European Commission and the way forward, which, you know, you can take with a pinch of salt or see it as my sort of 2 cents worth, if you will, for your discussions today and beyond. Now, by way of introduction, I quite often start by citing one of my favorite books on the subject, which is Max Tegmark's Life 3.0. I'll make a few sort of book droppings here on the way because I've been an avid student of the subject. I admit only for 4 years, but nevertheless. And Max Tegmark's book, apart from being a brilliant overview of the digital revolution in which we are, very neatly puts us human beings into 3 categories of approaches. Number one are basically the tech optimists, the one who say that, you know, robotization, artificial intelligence, machine learning, self-learning, it'll rectify itself. Just let things happen and good things will come out of it. Obviously, I'm simplifying. Secondly, there's a category of people who are tech pessimists who would, after my talk today and our discussion, say, you guys are on Star Trek, you're on a different planet, this shit is not going to happen in the next 50 years, you don't have to worry about machine learning. Yeah, the game Go, not a big deal as such. You know, tell me the moment when a computer starts to cry, that's when we can start talking about real development. So they're the ones who say, don't worry, I won't be around when the shit hits the fan. Then thirdly is a category to which I would argue that probably many, perhaps in this room, would belong, and it's the school of benign AI, the basic thinking that yes, AI and the instruments that it gives us are good, but somehow they need to be managed and controlled so things don't run rampant. So let's use the instrument, but let's use it in the form of trustworthy AI or human-centric AI or whatnot. So these 3 categories I think are quite good, and I should come out of the closet immediately and say, yes, of course, I belong to the 3rd category, not only because I'm a former regulator, But I'm also, I guess, a former researcher of sorts, and I do think that this is such a fundamental thing that it needs to be controlled in one way or another. My second and final point on the introduction is to say that, and I'm simplifying, I think there are three competing models as well, not only optimist, pessimist, and benign, but the three competing models are between what I would argue the three future superpowers of this world: China, the United States, and the European Union. And you will understand that I am, of course, pushing the realm of truth by saying that the European Union will act on this fundamentally in a unified fashion. But my point here is that the way in which data is dealt with in superpowers such as China, whether it comes to social ranking or general data mining or giving up information about what, who, and where you are, is completely different from the way in which data is dealt with in the United States, where of course it's seen more in a competitive context, and the way in which it can be used, whether it's a tech giant, Silicon Valley, or otherwise. And again, a qualification, I'm not coming onto this stage to start bashing the tech giants. That's not my approach to things. My approach to things, I hope, is more sober in the sense that we have to understand that these tech giants nowadays have pretty much more power than many democratic states. And therefore, the way in which we deal with these should not be fully optimistic, benign, or pessimistic. We have to find a way to think about how to deal with them. And then, of course, there's a European way of dealing with data, which is very focused on privacy, not only through the GDPR, but otherwise as well. And if the European Union is one thing, it is a regulatory superpower. It is probably the best and the most robust regulator in the world. And it doesn't matter what the subject is. Believe me, the EU knows how to regulate, for better or for worse. Okay, so my introduction is the digital revolution will change everything. You will have three approaches to it: optimist, pessimist, benign. You will have three superpowers dealing with it: China, the US, and the EU, probably in a different way. Point number one, the digital revolution will change the economy and the way in which we work. Classic book to read on this is Brynjolfsson and McAfee on platforms, machines, and crowds, or machines, platforms, and crowds. Here the starting point is of course very simple, and that is to say that we're moving in a phase of the economy where machines are replacing a lot of the tasks that we used to do. At the same time, many of the economies and big companies nowadays are more based on platforms than traditional exchanges of products and services, or at least the platforms are used for the exchange. I don't need to start mentioning Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, and the rest of it. So we're seeing a new form of economy grow. But the more interesting bit here is then linked to the future work and the way in which both the revenue and value added and productivity is either increased or decreased. There are many studies, of course, that have made claims, and I think this started a few years back, 10-ish, with a study saying that half of the jobs that we do nowadays will vanish by 2030. You hear different types of figures and different types of definitions. I'm not excessively worried about that part, because I think that the way in which we work will change over time, and it of course already has. The interesting bit is that in the olden days we used to think that it's only about manual labor or traditional blue-collar work, but as a matter of fact I think white-collar work will be much more hardly hit. Yes, there will be no truck drivers. Yes, there will be no taxi drivers in the future. Yes, airplanes will be run by machines. We'll move on to that, but the bottom line is that a lot of the mundane tasks that our brain used to be doing will be transferred. My wife is a lawyer, a British lawyer. British-Finnish nowadays for rather obvious reasons. A lot of people want to have dual nationalities. And I picked up a wonderful study. Well, I picked up a study where you had two top lawyers examining a legal text, a contract of 2 to 3 pages, and then you had a machine. And the two top lawyers were given the task of finding the mistakes in that text, and as was the machine. The two top lawyers, they found 85% of the textual mistakes in the contract in about an hour and a half. The computer found 95% of the mistakes in 22 seconds. Now, am I trying to say that, great, we're going to have a future without lawyers? No, I'm not. But I want to illustrate that the way in which we're used to working is changing. Now, that's great. We will find different types of tasks. But the big worry that I have with the way in which AI and robotization is changing the economy and the way in which we work is linked more to our status as human beings. What drives us, and not only social status. Yuval Harari talks about this pretty much in all of his 3 books, Homo Sapiens, Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He talks about the potential of and this is his words, not mine, so no scandals. He says that we might be in the process of creating a useless class. In other words, a human being that does not necessarily have a political or an economic value. And that will be a fundamental problem, not only for society by and large, but for each and every individual. And of course, the line of thinking there is that, the first industrial revolution, steam engines and electricity and the rest of it, what did it bring? It brought, you come from Trieste, it brought with it Marxism, workers' rights. You had an economic entity and a unit that the capitalist could address. Give him or her shorter working hours, a pension, a health care, so on and so forth. You could address that. That human being had a net worth. But what if we come to a stage where these types of tasks are not necessary anymore? What kind of jobs will we have in the future? Well, of course, taking care of each other is one of the key ones. And one of the things I always say is that as we move more and more towards a world where we're hybrids with AI and the machines that deal with it, the more important it is that you and I develop a good sense of empathy, the way in which we deal with other human beings. It's great for you to sit in a group and be completely quiet, as we Finns always do. We don't say anything, we just look at these things. And it's great that the virtual world has become much smaller. I can communicate with anyone at any time. But sometimes it's quite sad to notice that the real world, the physical world, has become much larger because we're not connecting with our dose of empathy as well as we used to. I don't know what you guys do when you wake up in the morning. Is the first thing you do is to kiss your spouse, or is the first thing you do is look at your smartphone? I don't know. I don't have the data to. Or have you found yourself at the breakfast table? I'm a morning person, so I like mornings. But have you found yourself at the breakfast table with the whole family, looking at the news or what's going on? So what I'm trying to say is that, it's changing everything. So the economy and work. And I don't want to be in a situation where we have a useless class and a useful class. I'm not saying that every individual is created equal. We are, but the problem is we cannot be in a system where we must start creating a completely unequal society. And I'll get to that in a little bit. My second point is that AI and data linked to it is changing both politics and media. So the way in which we decide and the way in which we communicate. I don't know if you remember, but I vividly remember I was foreign minister in 2010, 2011 when the Arab Spring kicked off. And then the big narrative for all of us was that this is a fantastic time to be alive. Fukuyama was correct. We're seeing the end of history. Everyone will revert to liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. And we will all abide by not only Western values, but universal values of human rights, fundamental rights, freedom, rule of law, protection of minorities, and the list goes on. And the Arab Spring, of course, was a symbol of that. People that were gathered onto squares to protest and demonstrate and topple regimes in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere. Well, the question is, did we create digital democracies? Or did we actually create digital dictatorships? And I think this is the big debate in politics today. You know, if we fundamentally believe that the best form of governance is a democracy of one way or another, you could of course question that. And I say this not tongue-in-cheek, but if you look at democratic politics in the United States at the moment, or if you look at, God forbid, democratic politics in the United Kingdom at the moment, you know, you could pose a question that, is this the most sensible form of governance that we have seen? I'm an eternal optimist. I think that democracy has a tendency to rectify itself. But the bottom line is that the tools at our hand, the instruments of data, artificial intelligence, and elsewhere, they're being used in a way in which we did not envisage them to be used. You know, there's the eternal debate between George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, where George Orwell brings in the big brother and says that this way we can control, right? You know, if you had even had more foresight, 1984 would have been talking about, you know, pure social ranking. I guess the Animal Farm did. All animals are equal, some are just more equal than others. But Aldous Huxley's thesis was a little bit different. As a matter of fact, we'll be so attached and dependent upon our gadgets that we will not want the freedom anymore. Now, my thesis on the democracy side comes from a book that I just listened to because I've been into audiobooks lately. It's called People versus Tech. I think it's James Bartlett. Correct me if I'm wrong. And what he did was to try to explain through Tversky's and Kahneman's think fast, think slow. You remember system 1, system 2. System 1 is in our brain when we're emotional, we think fast, we react to something. So right now you're pretty much on system 1 because you're trying to figure out what the hell is the guy saying up there and reacting to it, sometimes emotionally, sometimes rationally. System 2 is the more contemplative one, when you go back home and you look at your notes from this event, what did I get out of it? And you start slowly sort of processing the stuff. Now, the argument here is, and I'm using Bartlett, but I think it's a good one. He says that modern democracy is system 1, but liberal democracy, as it was thought of by Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and the rest of it, that is actually system 2. So liberal democracy should be slow, contemplative, looking for compromises, and getting messy decisions at the end of the day. But we live in a system 1 world where you cannot, as a legislator, you cannot anymore contemplate because someone will attack you instantly. We live in this sort of Twitterati world where you're afraid to really say anything. And that is the problem that we have with democracy. Now, so we're not moving necessarily towards a digital democracy, or at least I haven't found a way of dealing with it. You could talk about, direct democracy, voting on issues in referenda with your mobile phone. But is that what we want? Do we want to live in a fully binary world, where everything is black and white? I guess it's black and white to be a member of the European Union or not. But is this the type of representative democracy that we want? That's a question. Digital dictatorships again. I mean, this has been like a godsend for some countries. If you want to control your populations through mining of data or otherwise, all the instruments are there. I mean, in our Q&A, you will probably raise a few issues, for instance, in China on the social ranking systems. I just heard the mind-boggling statistic, which I think you must have heard as well. Again, I haven't verified this, but that there are 23 million people in China who are not allowed to travel. It reminds me of these sort of Black Mirror type of Netflix thingies. where you can really start using the information. You can, of course, take this into media and communication as well. I mean, as a former politician, it's always dangerous for me to say anything about, the media, because someone might interpret it in a wrong way. But we're, of course, moving into a space whereby the so-called traditional media, again, which used to be System 1, even after the telegraph was invented, but it used to be slow, contemplative. You had your foreign correspondents, sitting in the patio somewhere in Cuba writing a story about what was going on and sending it back, and then it'll be published in 2 weeks or something like that. Right now, all of us are just gobsmacked looking at Donald Trump's tweets on his conversation with the president of Ukraine a week ago, right? Or looking at the parliamentary debates at Westminster, live, and so on and so forth. So communication for traditional media is very difficult because social media has entered that space. So it's become almost, if there's direct democracy, it's become a bit direct media. Everyone is a media of sorts. You are a media. I assume this is an open event, so some of you might be tweeting right now. So basically, you're then you're working as a filter about what I'm saying. And then we come, of course, to the issue: how do you verify, the stuff that's been sent? Because the problem is, of course, that there's a lot of fake news out there. And of course, when we have algorithms through Facebook or elsewhere, which can basically start generating, snowballing that data to the line that we like, then we run into trouble. And we've seen a lot of examples on this. The way in which, we get our views, they can be liberal, they can be conservative, they can be racist, fascist, whatever. We get them confirmed through algorithms which start pushing that type of news. And how do we control that? How do we go to this Hans Rosling factfulness type of stuff? So the whole world of politics and the whole world of media and communication is vastly changing. I don't know if I'm just an old fart, but I hope that my kids can filter the information that they get. They're 18 and 15. They're probably much better at that. But there are times when they come, Papa, did you see that? And I look at it, well, guys, this is crap. This is not real stuff. But, and again, we get to the System 1. We get really het up and emotional about stuff that we see without System 2 recognizing that perhaps we should, question the data that's been thrown in our brain. Now, my third and final point before the conclusion, so the first one was that the digital revolution changes the economy and the way in which we work. The second, it changes politics and the way in which we communicate. The third one is to say that it also changes science and therefore, I think, the future of mankind. And here we get into rather theoretical and sometimes a little bit spooky stuff as well. But I'll just, throw these things out here. The first one is, of course, a combination of biology and technology. I actually belong to the category of people who believe that in the first world, many of us are already hybrids by now. We cannot live without technology. We're just completely tied into it. And I'm not, talking only about maps and books and music and audio and writing and messaging and traveling and the rest of it. But, try to live without a mobile phone, for a month. Good luck. It's wonderful if you try it, I mean, in Finland we have a mökki, which is like a country place, right? Everyone goes to the mökki. Well, turn off your damn phone for a month at the mökki and read some books. I mean, you'll come out with sort of your brain just accelerated into serious thinking. Whereas nowadays we're just, we are in this. Have you used any of the apps which calculate how many times you pick up the phone a day? It's scary shit, huh? I mean, it's horrible. I mean, I'm not even going to say how many times I do it. But the bottom line is that we are hybrids. We can't live without this stuff anymore. Think about that when we move into the sphere of biology being mixed with the technology. When one day, tech optimist speaking, neural laces will be able to direct our thought and direct connection with technology. In many ways a wonderful thing, but at the same time quite scary, and it changes what we are as Homo sapiens. The advancement of science. Wonderful that we can, I guess already now to a certain extent through Flink, fluid ink and 3D printing start to print organs. We don't need organ transplants anymore. We can need the transplants, but it can be fabricated to work just for our body. That day will come. That's great stuff. Someone gets an arm amputated, and then they can create an arm which is just like, I just fractured my wrist 8 weeks ago. Yeah, you can feel sorry for me. I fell off a bike while I was trying to FaceTime. It really shows you that artificial intelligence is sometimes better than biological intelligence. But nevertheless, it didn't get amputated. We're okay. But an arm can be fabricated, and then a neural lace can give commands to that arm. Great. But what if that arm gets a bug? It gets a cyber attack, and as I would, Second Amendment, I would be carrying a handgun, and I'd start shooting someone. Who is held responsible? I mean, those types of issues will emerge. Cloning, of course. And here we come to the useless class argument. What if we get into a situation where through CRISPR, you can start sequencing and choosing the DNA and the genes that you have? So, dark hair, blue eyes, intelligent, muscular, big feet, small feet. Are we then all created equal? If that costs a hell of a lot of money to start doing that at an early stage? No, we're not. So it has a lot of potential, but it also has some ethical and moral implication. And that's why I think we need some serious talk about the value base, much like we have, I think, outlawed internationally organ trade. We should start thinking about this seriously. Okay, so here we come to my conclusion, and sorry for being a little bit long. 3 conclusions for what I think we should do, and I'm looking at this, of course, with my European lenses on. First one is trustworthy AI, the second one is competitive AI, and the third one is global AI. By trustworthy AI, I mean that we need to give everyone, and I don't use the word citizens because that's always derogatory and speaking of yourself in third person, but everyone a comfortable feeling about artificial intelligence. So it needs to be, number 1, lawful, so there needs to be a legal base. Number 2, it needs to be ethical, so there needs to be a feeling that it's right. And number 3, it needs to be robust. This comes from a wonderful study commissioned by the European Commission and chaired by Pekka Ala-Pietilä, former Nokia guy. And I think the report was it called Trustworthy AI or Human-Centric AI? One or the other. Look it up, it's good. Number 2, I think we need competitive AI from a European perspective. That means that we need to put more money into innovation. Look, you've probably read a book called AI Superpowers by Kai Fu, forget the name, Chinese-American. Basic argument, the big superpowers of AI are the US and China because when the champion of the game Go lost to AlphaGo, there was a lot of money and research put into AI, and China hasn't looked back. I think Europe needs to do the same thing. And this competitive AI also means investment. And competitive AI also means regulation. And competitive AI, as we have seen, also means antitrust or competition policy. And it'll be interesting to see what the next commission does with, for instance, tech giants such as Google and Facebook and others. My third and final conclusion is global AI. I think we need to see some European leadership on this. I'd much rather the good guys fix some of the final algorithms than the bad guys. And this basically means that we need international treaties. I guess the UN, which is working on it, is the right place to do this, but Europe needs to show some leadership on this as well, because we're right now at the tipping point where things could start going really fast with AI, and if we don't have clear rules on this, I think we're in trouble. And finally, what should Europe do with the three big players, or including itself? One is to cooperate with China, to think about ways in which to skew things in the right direction. My big fear is that we were all gung-ho about free trade and openness with China for a few decades, and I hope that we don't turn exactly the opposite way now, because we're starting to get afraid of Chinese acquisition. I wrote a Financial Times column in 2016 saying that for China, Europe is the new Africa. And the basic idea was that China was mining IP in Europe in a similar way in which they were mining raw materials in Africa. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but you get my point. With the US, I think we are on the same ethical and moral lines here. And that's why I think, and right now it's probably a little bit complicated to cooperate with the US administration, but this could be a very good project where we find a common tone, technological advancement in general. And for the EU, I think for the next commission, Malte, next 5 years, the big project should be AI. Yes, climate change as well, but this is where the world is going, and given that the EU is a regulatory superpower, this is what we should do. So here, ladies and gentlemen, in half an hour, fairly briefly, three things that I think the digital revolution will change. Number one is the economy and the way in which we work. Number two is politics, media, and the way in which we communicate. And number three is science and the future of mankind. And as you can see, I'm very high-tech in my notes. Thank you.